Hello, everyone, and welcome to your Week 2 lecture for Politics 3520. We are starting this week on the topic of understanding war, and you can see we have on our screen here images of Freud, Margaret Mead, and Chris Hedges. These are people who offer different types of views on whether war is part of human nature or not. And what you're going to see, I think, when we move through the topics they cover, is an argument that moves from the idea that sort of man is sort of strangely cursed, to sort of put my own little spin on Freud there for a second, to participate in war. Margaret Mead has an anthropologist's perspective and believes that actually, if you look at the data from our study of history and anthropological history specifically, there's no real evidence that man is warlike at all. And then finally coming back to Chris Hedges, who I think, in a sense, I won't say tries to combine the best of both theories, but as you'll see, has a kind of a more fine-grained approach to the experience of war and what war does for us sociologically. And that's a complex point. So let me not try to explain that right now, and I'll come back to it once I've done the work. But last week we had our videos on from Galtung, and you guys wrote in your journals about that. So let me just go straight into giving you some thoughts on your journals from last week. So first things first is obviously just a reminder not to post attachments. Not to post your journal as an attachment. You should copy and paste the text into your text editor. That's the text editor window that comes up when you're posting your journal. I'd like to see your journal copied and pasted in there. You should write it on your laptop or computer or whatever, copy and paste it over, and then maybe take some time to make sure that you've got the formatting right. You may want to do the little drop-down window to where you have different style options, whether it should be paragraph or header or whatever. Pick paragraph and then make sure that your spacing is correct. That's just to help get rid of any artifacts left over from the editor you wrote it in, which could have been like Microsoft Word or something. And sometimes if you've written it in a fancy Microsoft Word document, you're going to get some legacy formatting from that. So that's all I'm really trying to avoid there for you. Anyway, just a couple of things to talk about, I suppose. The Galtung piece is interesting for us. I like to start with it because, well, he was the founding father of peace studies, and not to sort of try to situate him in one perspective or another, just to sort of talk about this person who was a veteran, or is a veteran of the study of peace. He's been around it longer than anyone else. And he was commenting in these videos, this video prior to Donald Trump becoming president, but I think you can already kind of see some of the questions that we're dealing with today to do with the alt-right and stuff emerging because of the case study that he raises, which is the case of Anders Breivik. Breivik was not mentally ill. That's the most important thing to know. Some in the Norwegian justice system argued that anyone who can do something like that must be mentally ill, right? But I think Galtung is definitely keen to emphasize that to write the man off as mentally ill kind of does a disservice, even though he's obviously a very violent person and has done some terrible things in his life. To write him off as mentally ill is to kind of deny the power of his ideas. And those ideas aren't just his, right? They're shared by people on the right, the far right specifically, the neo-Nazi fascist right. There's a lot of talk about them right now in the aftermath of the election in 2016, which made Donald Trump the president of the United States. And the point is, I guess, that reducing Breivik to a mentally ill person without listening to the ideas that he was espousing possibly leaves us at risk from those ideas down the road, and might leave us at risk of misunderstanding the kind of ideas that Donald Trump and his presidency have legitimized here in the United States, for example. Now, Galtung doesn't go into that, but I think you can see where his points become germane in relationship to that. So now, reading your journals, some of you are going to be focusing, I see, on the outrage, the global outrage over Breivik, to a relative lack of outrage, and an interesting lack of outrage that was on display in Norway, but also elsewhere, about, for example, soldiers, NATO soldiers operating in Afghanistan. It's an interesting comparison because really this is the question, I suppose, where if the West has sort of a finite sum of moral outrage to spend in the bank, so to speak. There's a moral outrage bank somewhere. The West has clearly, in its culture, in its media, spent that moral outrage on things like these extreme cases of violence, whether it be the Virginia Tech shooting in 2007, Anders Breivik, or the alt-right young man from Ohio who drove his car into protesters in Charlottesville in 2017, in August 2017. Where does our attention go? I think that's the question. Why do we get worked up over certain things and not about others? Where is our moral outrage about Afghanistan? It's the longest running war in US history. Donald Trump has recently committed to re-entering that fight after previous politicians have tried to surge and withdraw, whether that was George Bush or Barack Obama. The reality is this a conflict that has now lasted through 2 presidencies, and as I said, it's the longest running conflict in US history. Why are we going back in there again, and where is the outrage? Who decides what victims are worthy of our outrage? Who are these others that are seen to be less deserving? Another example is the hurricane that hit Texas in the August of 2017, and at the same time there was extreme weather in Bangladesh and India, and it didn't really generate the same media attention, even though thousands of people died in Bangladesh and India. Only a handful of people died in Texas, and that's not to say that it wasn't a disaster that happened in Texas either, but the United States is a wealthy country and it will recover after Texas. So we really have to assess, I think Galtung wants us to try to assess for whom we are querying and investigating these outrages, right? So one interesting point that comes out of Galtung as well, I think, is the question of whether we are, happy to think of someone like Breivik as an extremist and a weirdo, that happened in Europe. But I guess also with the rise of fascism, the return of fascism, if you will, in the United States. And I want to put an asterisk on that because I think there's important questions to be raised about whether or not that actually is the case. I mean, has there been a return of fascism in the United States? But let's just say there is for a minute. I mean, you could argue that some of it is embedded in a kind of kind of First Testament Christian mindset. I don't know that the neo-Nazis necessarily espouse that, but certainly there is a history in the United States. It's a marginal history, but it is there. It is real of a sort of a Christian evangelical terrorism. The Unabomber, the Timothy McVeigh kind of questions the various attacks on mosques and things like this that have come up. The Columbine shooting, the Virginia Tech shooting. Not all of these people were Christians, but some could say that they shared a kind of an extreme redemptive view of the cleansing power of violence that is derived from, in some ways, the rhetoric that some interpret as being present in the First Testament of the Bible. You'll see many conservative commentators in the United States argue in no uncertain terms that, the religion of Islam is steeped, according to them, in violent rhetoric, and that somehow explains Islamic fundamentalism. But while I think, there's ample evidence of attention to this in Western media when it comes to Islam, we're not so good at questioning our own domestic violence and the role of a kind of a redemptive vision, whether that's a secular redemptive vision or a Christian-inspired redemptive vision going on right here at home. Now, another topic that comes up in your journals and comes up in the Galtung video is the Occupy movement. He asks the question, was the Occupy movement America's Arab Spring? You could extend that, I think, and look at the kind of spirit in Occupy, which was a left-wing phenomena, to be fair, right? But I wonder, because of the kind of, some people describe the Madrid and various Latin American instances of the Occupy movement as being motivated by in Spanish, que se vayan todos type of argument, which means let them all be gone, and if you'll excuse my use of bad language for a minute, I mean, the point is to say that, fuck the politicians, right? They have, and this is all coming in the aftermath of 2008, and of course Galtung, I think, is emphasizing that due to the mismanagement of the financial economy, so many people lost their jobs, so many people lost their homes, and there was a real question, like, my God, what are our elites doing with the economy here, right? And if post-2008, I think you saw a left expression of that, I think one has to wonder if the 2016 election of Trump might also represent a kind of a fuck you moment. I say that, and it might be a controversial point, because obviously there'll be people who, in this class, who may have voted for Trump, or who may agree with his politics. That's fine. There may be people in the class who would have preferred to vote for Hillary Clinton. That's fine too. We're going to maybe all agree to disagree. I'm not going to necessarily give you my own views on this, but I am interested in sort of the sociological aspect of it. And it seems clear to me from the data, and I'm thinking about Galtung's comments here as well, that there might have been a kind of a fuck you aspect to the election of Trump. It's worth remembering that Hillary won the popular vote, and Trump was elected with fewer votes, actually, than Romney or McCain received in their elections. So that's an interesting starting point for thinking about the significance of the Trump presidency. He won by default, and I think a lot of the people who voted for him were voting for him not because he was good necessarily, but because they weren't too impressed with Hillary. Again, it's that aftermath of the Occupy movement, the kind of que se vayan todos. These guys are all useless, so let's get rid of the political elites. Let's drain the swamp, as Trump argued. And Trump, of course, is coming at it from a conservative or right-wing perspective. But don't forget that Bernie Sanders was making similar arguments last year as well from the left. Very, very different ideologies, very, very different ways of dreaming about a better world. Trump and Bernie Sanders are by no means the same person, yet both became incredibly popular, and their popularity was unprecedented, I think, in American politics, because not in my lifetime anyway have we seen candidates with that kind of rhetoric becoming popular in American electoral politics. So it's worth taking that seriously and seeing, the arguments that Galtung is making are still very, very germane. America's Arab Spring, so to speak. You don't have to agree with me here, right? But I'm just kind of speculating aloud here. Can we extend Galtung's point about the American Arab Spring to the election of Trump. Now, of course, since the election of Trump, we've seen a different President Trump than we saw as a candidate Trump. President Trump is seemingly much more militarist than candidate Trump. That's interesting because one of his major sort of pillars in his campaign was to try to get America out of its foreign entanglements. He is an economic populist, and he was very critical, for example, of America's NATO allies for not paying their fair share of of global defense. Where's that rhetoric now? It seems to have gone out the back window. It's still present from time to time in his speeches, but policy-wise, there's no doubt that Trump is, and there's many theories we can conjecture as to why this might be so, but policy-wise, I think definitely Trump is, either continuing or even intensifying some of Obama's policies. So that's very interesting. And it does raise the question about the place in Western liberal democracy, if you want to use the term broadly to encompass both liberals and conservatives in America, but also in Europe, that we might have a securitization issue, that we seem to deal with our disputes in highly militaristic ways. That's a point that's germane and relevant to the material we're going to be covering this semester. And with that in mind, securitization, or the tendency to deal with our problems through the lens of seeing our global political problems as security problems, is very relevant for us. Should we see our problems as security problems, or should we perhaps try to use a different register? North Korea is a very scary kind of problem for us right now, especially if we look at it through the lens of a sort of a military problem. But, there's a long history of North Korea being an intransigent country. They have a long history of trying to well, let me back up a second. North Korea is a country that's isolated from the world, and to survive, I'm not saying the regime is good or bad here. I'm just simply saying that this is an isolated country from global commerce. It's not a country that trades with the rest of the world. It is really isolated and cut off. And oftentimes in the past, to try to get the goods and services that they need, they have kicked up a ruckus to try to bring especially Western military and economic actors to the table to negotiate with them. And yeah, if you want to take the kind of Austin Powers, Dr. Evil kind of stance on what North Korea is, and it's a demented, crazy country led by a madman, this is the kind of caricature that's represented in a lot of Hollywood movies, then, sure, it's a military problem because you're dealing with a madman. But once you start to situate the problem we're having today with North Korea into the history of North Korean behavior, and you think about, how previous U.S. presidents, going all the way back to Clinton, if not beforehand, have had varying degrees of success and failure in managing North Korea, you start to see, I think, a fairly strong argument to be made that talking to North Korea actually works. I know that might sound crazy, but there is a history of it. If you look, especially in the late 90s, President, what was his name? Let me just put this on pause for a second, because I think it's Kim Dae-jung. Yeah, his foreign policy platform, and he, of course, was the South Korean president. He embraced what was called sunshine policy, which emerged under Clinton's presidency here in the United States, and it was very successful. Interestingly, I was living in South Korea, at the time myself, and so I studied this a lot, and it just strikes me that there's an interesting contrast to be made between what was happening in the relationship of the West with North Korea at that time versus what happened then when George Bush and the neoconservatives, the neoconservatives, if you don't know who they are the kind of key intellectuals that advised George W. Bush in his presidency about how to deal with America's security problems. They took a really rigorous stance on North Korea, and they broke off the policies that had previously been established by Clinton. And the result was a much worsening relationship with North Korea and the beginning in earnest of North Korea's nuclear program, which of course is a tremendous concern for us today. So all of those things are thoughts that have been provoked in me then by your journals and by thinking about Galtung, and I hope you found those useful. So now, with that said, let's move on and talk about, and we'll move through these quickly. We're just going to talk about our primary readings for this week, and maybe we'll do a little bit on Paul Mason at the end, okay? So let's get going. Now, I want to start just with thinking about the TV show Mad Men. I don't know if you guys will be familiar with it, but it's a fun show, and you've probably heard of it. It's not showing anymore, but you can, I think it just, the last season was last year. So it's still a very recent show, and if you watch season 1, episode 1, you could watch it this week if you want, if you can get your hands on it somehow. There's a wonderful moment where Donald Draper, the lead protagonist, talks to, this is based in the 1950s, and what's going on in the 1950s is that the United States government has just announced that cigarette smoking is bad for you, lethal for you, and they're going to start regulating it and requiring cigarette companies to put health warnings on cigarette packaging. And the cigarette companies are really freaking out about this, Marlboro, etc., really worried about what this is going to do to their sales. And they turn to an advertising executive on Madison Avenue in New York by the name of Donald Draper. Now, this bit's fictional. The context, of course, is very real, but the Donald Draper as a character is fictional. But he sort of represents, I think, a kind of amalgam of the attitudes and thinking of the advertising industry in the 1950s. And Donald Draper says to the cigarette executives, look, you guys, you don't have to worry about this. This is actually possibly even the best thing that's ever happened to you. Now, why am I talking about any of this in relationship to Freud? Well, because Freud's letter to Albert Einstein in your class readings for this week discusses a number of things, including what he calls the alloyed nature of the death instinct. I want you to think about that for a second. What is the death instinct? What is the death instinct for Freud? Well, I'm going to back off from that for a second, because if it's complex for you in the reading, I think the show Mad Men, season 1, episode 1, as I was saying, actually has a pretty good explanation of what exactly Freud was talking about. Donald Draper explains to the cigarette executives that Freud, this psychologist who, or psychiatrist even, who these guys had never heard of before, had a really interesting theory about human motivations, and said that the thing about them is they have what he called a death drive, or a death instinct. And this instinct compels us to try to feel alive. And the way we feel alive, the way we feel most alive, is actually when we're kind of confronted with danger. That's why we do extreme sports. That's why we like to parachute out of airplanes. I always wonder why people want to do that. It terrifies me. But we do extreme things. And Freud explains this, that, in modern life, when we all sort of live in our offices, or we live at home, or we commute and then go to our offices, and then we spend all day in our offices, and it doesn't feel like we're alive. We're very far from those things that challenge our visceral organs, our adrenal glands, our fight or flight response. It's when, our ancient ancestors saw a tiger coming out of the jungle. Sorry, stereotype, but whatever. That we got that fright and we got that rush and we had to run. And then later on, this is that feeling of exaltation. My God, I survived being eaten by a tiger. I survived a tiger attack. And it's this, I think, that's at the kernel of the death instinct for Freud. So what does it mean to say the alloyed nature of the death instinct? Well, it's because it contains within itself the drives of both eros and destruction. We have that kind of weird relationship to our own sort of imminent demise that we feel intensely aware, but also paradoxically imperiled at the same time when we're confronted with war. And what Freud sort of wants us to try to do is to think about how you could put that in check, right? How you could extract the love option from that and go forward on the premise of what he calls eros. He argues that, and I'm going to use my own words here, but this is kind of how I'm interpreting him, that the kind of caveman version of us is still very much with us. And so it's going to be hard to tap into eros, which is the genuine love, the love that transforms our souls, that brings us into relationship to each other because of that sort of mutuality of the experience of life that we recognize in each other. It's going to be hard to isolate and save and rescue that eros aspect of our love from the destructive aspect of our love, right? It's going to be a long haul, says Freud. It might never be possible. Now, that's going to sound really disappointing for some people who want to kind of come up with an intellectual argument for peace, because it means that we won't ever have a ability to find an argument for peace based in rationality, right? A lot of people like Immanuel Kant, a philosopher who we're going to meet in a few weeks' time, would argue, that the idea is to kind of rationally explain our problems to each other, and then in a sort of a democratic assembly to try to create a framework of rules and governance that can create peace for us. That is tricky for Freud, right? I think he believes that the adrenal gland aspect, the caveman aspect of our bodies is still kind of with us, and we're still kind of addicted to that rush of the challenge of war. So don't expect the animal, emotional element of man that loves war erotically, sensually, to go away anytime soon. Okay then. So what do you have to say to that? Well, one response to that is going to come from Margaret Mead, who you're reading this week. Now, she was an anthropologist. Freud says that and this is in your reading for this week, Freud says that he doubts the existence of so-called happy folk that know nothing of war. But Margaret Mead argues that for many of our species, that's not fair, right? If you look at older cultures, older civilizations, you find that despite the fact that they couldn't build skyscrapers or space shuttles, and they didn't have, the wonderful music of Britney Spears in their culture, they nevertheless didn't know what we understand as war being an organized, sociological, kind of economic outcome, because it requires vast infrastructure to generate the surplus wealth that you need to buy the equipment, to build the tanks, to make the spears, the bow and arrows, whatever have you. You've watched Game of Thrones. You know that war doesn't have to be technological. We're talking about, for Margaret Mead, like her example is the Eskimos. He says they are not a mild and meek people. They do no violence, right? They are turbulent and troublesome individually towards each other. They have ways of resolving their disputes through violence individually, but as a sociological sort of commentary, their clans don't have this economy of war, right? They don't have complex economies that are arranged to go to war, and when they're not at war, they're preparing their defense. They don't have standing armies. They don't have any armies. So why is this for Mead? What does it mean to say that war is an idea that only some people have invented. Some people, of course, here being the warlike peoples. Many of them live in the West. Many of them are us, are our European ancestors, for example. It's something to ponder. I don't think she necessarily gives answers to this question, but there's an anthropological question there that needs to be reckoned with. So if, and this is the significance of Mead's argument, if she's right, then maybe that does give further credence to Kant's version that some kind of rational communication must be possible that's going to prevent war. There must be some kind of way that we can get from the complex, unfortunate society that we live in today to something much more like the non-warlike society that so many civilizations in our history have known. Next, we move on to Chris Hedges, and the quote here is that we now live in a nation where doctors destroy health, lawyers destroy justice, universities destroy knowledge, governments destroy freedom, the press destroys information, religion destroys morals, and our banks destroy the economy. And this is kind of this question about how, in a sense, maybe in these various spheres of our existence, we have kind of let our processes, and this is an argument I'm getting from an Irish political scientist called Peter Mayer, but you don't need to know that, but that we've kind of let our institutions escape democratic accountability. And we can do better, right? That we need a democratic reawakening to bring back the say of the people in how these various institutions in our society have operated. In terms of war, however, Hedges, I think, doesn't necessarily view war and the experience of war as being sort of grounded or founded in this lack of democracy. I think what Hedges is trying to get at, and you probably see this in the reading, is that there is a kind of an experience that you have in war that almost backs up what Freud was claiming, that the simplicity of the soldier's life does have a kind of a sensual aspect to it. And there's dangers that happen in this, I think, says Hedges. Obviously, we have a culture of war, we have myths of war, but if you look at the war on terror, for example, there was a passion, a kind of a meaning that we found in suddenly having an enemy. We hadn't had an enemy in a real sense since the end of the Cold War. And it's possible that in the kind of moral relativism of our simplistic consumeristic society that emerged in the wake of the end of the Cold War, that's back in 1989, 1990, the heady days of Clintonism and consumerism and neoliberalism, that we kind of almost became sad that we didn't have an enemy anymore. And so there's a lovely kind of a jubilant fix, if you will, an eroticism that emerges when you suddenly find that you have an ability to look at a moral compass and see where your North Star is again. In a purely economic society like capitalism, without an enemy, you don't really know what's right or wrong. This is Hedges' problem, that we don't know who to vote for, and so the elites start to get away with, murder. Frankly, we start to live in a very technocratic society, an administered society, not a democratic society. So what fires us up, what gets us going then, what returns us to some kind of moral compass? And I don't think it's a moral compass that Hedges wants, by the way. He's a pacifist, as far as I know. But he's trying to argue, much as Freud, I think, was, that there's a terrible aspect of our human nature that seems to curse us or condemn us to come back to war as the way of fixing the moral relativism of our society whenever we become too economic in our interactions with each other. So those people are your three supplemental readings in the Barash book for this week. Let me just now turn to, in the last 7 minutes or so, I think, of the talk, to thinking about Paul Mason and his text, Why It's Kicking Off Everywhere, which is the book that you are dealing with. And of course, the key concept here is the graduate with no future. And this is a concept that he uses to explain a phenomenal and unexpected historical development that took place in, the early part of this decade, 2011, thereabouts. We saw a wave of resistance and uprising against government. It started in Tunisia, but it spread like wildfire throughout the Middle East and then into Greece, Europe, and then ultimately the United States. It also showed up in Hong Kong. It showed up in China to an extent. A year and a half later, 2 years later, it showed up in Turkey and in Brazil during the Olympic Games that took place there. What was going on? The anarchist theorist David Graeber wrote a lot about this and argued that there was a kind of a desire on the part of people to, this is the guy that kind of invented the concept of the hashtag. Twitter was kind of getting going just at this moment as a political form. We're kind of used to thinking about Twitter as a political mode of expression now, but it was kind of new then. But David Graeber invented the hashtag We Are the 99%, which was central to the Occupy movement then. And of course, in 2016, it comes up again in some ways with the Bernie Sanders campaign, which I think had some connection with the Occupy movement. So inherent in this idea of the hashtag We Are the 99%, and Mason is good on this, I think, as well, is this idea that the world is now being run by a narrow set of elites. You can see it in the economic outcome of the 2008 financial crisis, which was resolved in an undemocratic fashion, according to these critics. They would argue that, the fact is that, the wealth of the United States and of the world is divided highly unequally on a global basis. The top 20% of the planet's population own 80% of the wealth. And I think something like 5 or 6 people own, 50% of the planet's wealth. And it's in that asymmetry, because of course with that asymmetry of wealth comes power. And with power comes the ability to influence politics, to arrange the political system to suit your own interests, and not the interests of the majority, not the interests of the masses. And in a country like America, where you can make an argument over the course of history that there's a strong cultural sense or idea that this is the land of opportunity, if you work hard, you can make it. Events like 2008 and the Wall Street crash that took place then, and the way it was resolved, clearly showed to many, many people. No one really went to jail for that. The prosecutor Eric Holder, who worked for Obama at the time, argued that he was the Attorney General, rather, Eric Holder. He argued that these guys were too big to jail, and what he meant by that was if he, as the the head lawyer, head government lawyer of the country, were to start investigating and prosecuting the heads of these big banks for the illegal actions that they had carried out, for their insider trading, etc., that it would cause, they were such a big part of the economy that it would cause, a tsunami, a tidal wave of destruction to take place, in our financial landscape. And 2008 had already been hard enough for people getting kicked out of their homes, and hard enough for the economy, that there was no real guarantee that doing the right thing by the law would be the right thing by the economy. And this just upset people, right? I mean, you can imagine, rightly so, right? I mean, we're still not recovered from this. Your generation, the average age of you guys in this class are, it's probably around 20, 21 years old. You're a generation people refer to as the Millennial Generation, and the reality is you're the first generation in U.S. history. You're the first generation in about 5 or 6 generations in U.S. history that won't do better than the preceding generation. And you're graduating from college with debt. You're graduating with an uncertain job prospect. You've done your part. You've studied hard. You graduated with straight A's, and it's still not clear, having done your bit, that society, that the economy is going to meet you halfway. Now, the theory of the kind of pull yourself up by your bootstraps approach to American prosperity, America's a land of opportunity, holds that if you work hard, there's opportunities for you. When people find that even though they work hard, the opportunities aren't there, there's hell to pay. We saw that on the left, we saw that on the right. We saw that on the left with the Occupy movement, we saw it on the right with the emergence of the Tea Party. Arguably today, you can see it still in the arguments of the so-called alt-right. The neo-Nazis often themselves make economically populist arguments. So, central to Mason's argument, to come back to Paul Mason, is that this idea of the graduate with no future, is a key figure here, right? Because it's emblematic. This graduate with no future is emblematic of the plight, of the struggle of a whole generation, the whole millennial generation, to try to articulate, young, perhaps inexperienced as they are, a new set of coordinates, a new moral compass for how the economy should be governed. So, a short lecture from me this week, just 40 odd minutes. But those are my main points that I wanted to raise with you. And I look forward to reading your journals on Thursday, guys. Okay, don't hesitate to hit me up on Slack if you have any questions or problems. I check it a couple of times a day, usually during the week, maybe not over the weekends, so don't expect me to answer on the weekends, but I'll try if I have time. But certainly, during the week, I hope it's a mechanism that we can use to communicate, and sort of better than emails sometimes, because it means that if you have a question and other people have the same question, then we're not needlessly reproducing each other's efforts here. It's a pleasure seeing you. Of course, I'm not seeing you, but I'll wave hi anyway. And you can hit me up on Slack as well for video chat or audio chat as well if you need to. If you want to talk to me in person, please feel very welcome to schedule that with me. You can drop me a private message, a direct message on Slack, or you can email me, and we can set up a video conference of some sort or an audio conference, and do our office hours that way. All right, guys, I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.